Okay, thanks very much. And thanks very much, everyone, for coming along tonight and having a listen. So first of all, in the spirit of reconciliation, Deakin University and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be joining us this evening. I myself am living and presenting this webinar on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. So it's fair to say that mammals are a really impressive group of animals. They're extraordinarily successful. They occupy our oceans, including species such as Cuvier's beaked whales, which are thought to be the deepest diving mammal, reaching depths of up to 3,000 metres, which is quite impressive. In this case, of course, this unfortunate Cuvier's beaked whale cannot reach those depths. It's actually being hunted here in the background by some orcas who are keeping it at the surface. We know, of course, cheetahs are known for their speed. They can go from 0 to 100 in 3 seconds, which is far more impressive than most sports cars that people get obsessed about. Now, of course, just a quick fact about cheetahs. They are not, in fact, the fastest mammal on Earth. That is actually a bat, a species of sheath-tailed bat in Mexico. So there's a fun fact for you there as well. And speaking of bats, bats, which occupy our skies, are really impressive and important animals as well. So its recent research has shown that some species of bats, including little red bats, can actually travel up to 5,000 kilometres or so in a year. And that's really important because as they're doing that, they're spreading seeds and pollen and so forth and helping to actually pollinate many of our plants and keep our forests and our woodlands and so forth in really good and healthy condition. So we should have much more love for our bats than many people do. Now, of course, that brings us to Australia. And it is fair to say, I think, that probably almost like nowhere else on Earth, Australia is renowned for its remarkable and unique mammals. And I want to quickly go through some of these different groups to give people a flavour for some of these amazing species that many of us know and love. If you don't see your favourite species here, I apologise. There is many to try and feature tonight. Before I do that, Australia's mammals in numbers. The most recent estimate for the number of species is about 404, and that's from 1788 until present. That includes introduced or feral species being 23, and unfortunately 34 extinct species since European invasion. 57 of those species are marine, terrestrial species or species on land, 347, and the flying and gliding mammals, that includes our bats, but also gliding possums, is 93 species. But what about these wonderful animals? Starting off with the monotremes, the echidnas, aside from being wonderful looking animals, they have a range of impressive tricks. They can go into torpor during fire to help them cope with the stress of fire and reduce energy use. They can actually change their basal metabolism rate depending on the environmental conditions. They also have the largest prefrontal cortex relative to body size for any mammal. And they are thought to be at least as intelligent as rats and cats. They form impressive trains during their breeding season when they're mating. So there's lots of wonderful things about echidnas that we're learning. Of course, the other monotreme, in this case, the venomous monotreme, the platypus. Moving on now to the koala, of course, which is an iconic species and unfortunately now is gaining a lot of attention in the news because of the impact of the fires, particularly, of course, in New South Wales and on Kangaroo Island. And koalas also face a range of threats that include dogs, but also, most importantly, habitat loss due to things like land clearing and urbanisation. So unfortunately, the iconic koala's future really is quite uncertain in many parts of Australia. And it's also really important to remember that although Australia does have a really large number of marsupials, we also have other non-marsupial mammals, and that includes our wonderful bat species. So here we have some microbats in the middle, and again, our fruit bats on either side, which I've talked about already about their importance for pollinating our forests. The spectacled flying fox here on the left is a species thought to be at real risk of extinction due to climate change. And in 1 year in Cairns, 20,000 or so bats died in a couple of days due to an extreme heat event where temperatures reached over 40 degrees for a couple of days. And those bats were unable to cope with that. So again, a species that really is suffering the effects of climate change like so many others. Tube-nosed bats, and again, grey-headed flying foxes. So we have many species of wonderful bats. Also marine mammals, of course, whether that be dugongs, seals, those are the more familiar to us, like dolphins, and things like elephant seals, these wonderful animals. Of course, many people's favourite might be the wombat. Wombats, again, have some really interesting features about them. One of the most impressive, I think, is a backward-facing pouch, which is something that's evolved to allow wombats to move around and not have soil go into their pouches as they're digging burrows. It also means that youngsters can actually feed from the back of mum while she's also moving around and grazing at the same time. They have square-shaped poo, which has always mystified scientists as to why they have that shaped poo. And it turns out it seems to be due to an elastic digestive tract. So as the scats or the feces move through that passage, they actually form that cubed shape that's very characteristic of wombats. And they're huge excavators. So they dig really large holes in the ground that they live in. And it's been shown that other animals can actually share those burrows with wombats, including during times of fire. So they have a really important role in helping other species to survive the impacts of fire. Unfortunately, some species, such as the northern hairy-nosed wombat, are endangered. And so our wombats, again, like many other mammals, need a lot more conservation effort. Moving on now to the possums and gliders, which are an incredibly diverse group of species, such as the sugar gliders, which are familiar to many of us, brush-tailed possums, which I'm sure many of you have heard run across your roofs at night, or maybe even inside your roof, creating a ruckus. Some species that may be more unfamiliar to you, such as the common cuscus or the spotted cuscus, the green ringtail possum from North Queensland, like the cuscus species. Green ringtails themselves are also at threat of climate change. As temperatures get too high in the rainforest, they're unable to cope or thermoregulate with those extreme temperatures. And the wonderfully diminutive flying glider, the feather-tailed glider, with this extraordinary feather-like tail. We also have the obligate or completely nectivorous marsupial possum. This is the honey possum. And this wonderful animal here, the striped possum, again from North Queensland's forests, with these modified fingers that they use to dig into trees, into rotting wood, and pull out grubs that they feed on. And we're learning lots about many of our possums and gliders, including the fact that there's more species than we appreciate. So a recent study has shown that sugar gliders, once thought to be one species, are in fact 3 species. So we now have the sugar glider, the crest glider, and the savanna glider from Northern Australia. Of course, the numbat, one of the rare species that is quite commonly out during the day. So many of Australia's mammals are quite difficult to observe because the vast majority of them are nocturnal. But the numbat comes out during the day, and it has an extraordinarily long tongue, more than 10 centimetres long, that it uses to feed on termites. Moving on now to our insectivorous and carnivorous marsupials, including things like the ningowie here, the red-tailed phascogale, the coulter, and this wonderful animal down here that I met one night driving between the Northern Territory and Queensland, the long-tailed planigale. Weighs less than basically half a Tim Tam and has this extraordinary flat head that allows it to get in between the cracks in cracking clay soils that it characteristically lives in. Some larger carnivorous marsupials, of course, include things like the quolls, or the chuditch here, the spotted-tailed quoll, the wonderful mulgara. Many of you will, of course, know the Tasmanian devil, the fat-tailed dunnart, and, of course, in this case, a yellow-footed antechinus. And the antechinus, of course, is famous for its particularly novel form of breeding, where all the females at one part of the year are pregnant with the young, and all the males die. So they have one breeding event where the males essentially stop feeding and are singly focused on breeding and nothing else, and eventually die. So quite an extreme form of life history in breeding. Our wonderful bandicoots and bilbies, which are incredible diggers, and I'll talk more about that later in this talk, have a really important role. And they include things like the golden bandicoot, the eastern barred bandicoot, and of course the bilby. Another really wonderful group of animals that I think doesn't really get the love that they deserve, but are incredibly diverse and are a really speciose group of mammals in Australia are in fact our native rodents. We have some wonderful species in Australia, including the black-footed tree rat pictured here, and this top left-hand corner here as well. The desert mouse, the heath mouse, the white-tailed rabbit rat, and the Spinifex hopping mouse down in the left-hand corner there. The Spinifex hopping mouse is thought to have the most efficient kidneys of any mammal, and so much so that it doesn't actually need to drink at all. It gets all its water from its food and doesn't need to drink at all. And we're constantly finding new surprises about our native rodents as well. So as an example, the ricali, or sometimes known as the water rat, but the ricali is a much more wonderful name. These animals have actually learnt to cope with an invasive species, the cane toad. They're essentially surgeon-like. They can flip cane toads onto their backs and actually literally eat their hearts out. So incredibly wonderful animals. Many people call them Australia's response or version of the otter. Beautiful animals, very common in many of our cities, including Melbourne, but have learnt this really handy trick of dealing with cane toads, which gives us some hope that in some areas that the native animals may actually fight back against this invasive species. Now moving on to probably my favourite group of marsupials, and yes, I'm very biased because I've worked on macropods to a large degree, and again, incredibly diverse group. So many people, of course, know red kangaroos and eastern grey kangaroos, but there's a very large number of species in this group, well over 50 species, and that includes quite small examples like the musky rat kangaroo, the spectacled hair wallaby, tree kangaroos, which again, an incredibly bizarre thing to see in the rainforests of North Queensland that literally hop through the branches and climb up the branches. It's quite an amazing thing to see. The rufous bettong. Some of those species that may be more familiar to you include the agile wallaby, eastern grey kangaroo, the pretty face or whiptail wallaby, the marla, the swamp wallaby, and of course, one of Australia's most beautiful macropods, the yellow-footed rock wallaby. There's many amazing features of the anatomy and of the life history of macropods. I think one of the most interesting ones is their ability to go into diapause or embryonic diapause, where they can basically have a fertilized embryo that is essentially in a state of pause, and they will develop that when the conditions are right. And they can also have 3 different young of different stages, if you like. So a joey in the pouch, a fertilized embryo, and what we call a young at foot outside the pouch, all at the same time. And they can produce different milk from their teats as well. So incredibly nifty animals. And my favourite's the Antillopine Wallaroo, which I focused on for my PhD research a few years ago now, which have this incredibly beautiful red of the males and the sort of grey colour of the females. And you can see again, like many macropods, a huge difference in body size between the males and the females. So there's a large adult male here and a female, and this is a female young at foot. Now, although we have a really diverse mammal fauna, we also have really diverse language associated with those species. And I think one thing that I would really encourage lots of people to do after tonight is to go away and look up what these words are in terms of the corresponding species. These are all Indigenous Australian names for our marsupials. Some of them might, you might recognise, like Quenda, which is the bandicoot. This species here is the marsupial mole, the chuditch being the western koala, and others. But I really encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous culture associated with our mammal species. Now, of course, we've lost many mammals as well. Many species have gone extinct, and some many tens of thousands of years ago. So the Megafauna, as an example, Diprotodont, a wombat-like animal that was the size of a Volkswagen, short-faced kangaroos, giant kangaroo species, the famous marsupial lion, Thylacine, and of course it's worth remembering that thylacines not only used to be in Tasmania, but occurred right throughout large parts of Australia. And in fact, if you go to Kakadu National Park, you can see cave paintings of thylacines there. And we have suffered an extraordinary number of extinctions in Australia of our mammals. As a proportion of the group, an incredibly high proportion. And probably the most famous example of that, of course, is the Thylacine. And Threatened Species Day, which was just recently, is so named after the extinction of the Thylacine, or the last Thylacine in captivity, Benjamin, that died in 1936 in the Hobart Zoo, and died because it was left out overnight in a concrete enclosure and died of exposure. Now, these are all tragedies, but I guess more tragic than that is that these extinctions continue. So we've had recent extinctions of the Bramble-Cay melomys, the Bramble-Cay melomys here on the right, and the Christmas Island pipistrelle. And although, you know, they are tragic, what we're also seeing, of course, is that many other species continue to be at risk of extinction. So 56 species are estimated to be at risk, and another 52 species are what we call near threatened. So they're on their way to being at risk of extinction as well. So we really have a huge problem on our hands with conserving our mammals in Australia, despite the fact that they are unique in most cases and found nowhere else on Earth. So now I want to quickly talk about some things that we're finding out about mammals through the research done by students and colleagues and so forth. And first I want to talk about long-nosed potoroos. So on French Island, and this work was done by a honours student, Viviana Maritis, and done in conjunction with staff at Zoos Victoria, as well as Philippine nature parks. And we know that many of our native mammals face huge threat from feral cats in particular. And as you can see here, this sequence of camera trap images, we have the potoroo up here, and you can see feral cats occurring in these other images below, and in fact carrying off the potoroo, unfortunately, below as well. So what we wanted to learn more about is, are there situations or you know, areas or particular areas of habitat where potoroos may do better and potentially be able to live or at least coexist with feral cats. Now, we know that we have lots of sanctuaries that conserve our native mammals, and they have a really, really important role. But it's also important to find situations where our native mammals might be able to exist outside of sanctuaries, particularly because feral cats occupy more than 99% of Australia, so nearly 100%. And we need to find ways, therefore, for native wildlife to coexist with these feral animals, unless we can find an effective broad-scale control method for feral cats. And also, these potoroos have a really important role in particularly spreading fungi. So much of the time they spend digging, looking for fungi, and those fungi help to keep, again, our plants healthy and our ecosystems healthy. And what we found through this work done by Viviana is that where cats and potoroos occur, potoroos are selectively looking for areas of denser vegetation. And this is really important finding because many parts of Australia have suffered severe land clearing or overgrazing by things like livestock, or in some cases, even native animals like kangaroos. And so this loss of habitat may actually compound predation. So if we can conserve habitat, this may actually allow us to have a better chance at conserving some of our native mammals. What's also really interesting is that it seems like the potoroos and the cats are actually playing a deadly game of hide and seek. And the potoroos may be potentially avoiding the peak areas of activity, or times of activity, I should say, of when it is most risky for feral cats. So if we look on the x-axis here, these are time periods in 24 hours taken from camera trap images. And what you can see is this shaded area shows that most of the time, cats and potoroos are overlapping. But if you look at when the peaks of activity are occurring for both potoroos with a dashed line and the solid line being feral cats, over 2 seasons, the peak of activity for potoroos is actually offset. And that actually changed through time. And so what it suggests is that potoroos might actually be realizing, of course, that they face this threat from feral cats, but they're choosing to be active when cats are least or lesser active. And that may actually give them a higher chance of survival in the presence of these feral cats. Moving on to another important species, and this is the eastern barred bandicoot. And this is work done by Lauren Halstead, an ex-Deakin honours student. And this was really looking at the importance of digging mammals, and particularly, of course, this species, the eastern barred bandicoot. Now, we have to remember that many of Australia's digging mammals, of that number that have already gone extinct, have been lost. And so we've lost that digging that happens across really large areas of Australia. And as we're finding out, that digging that they do a lot of the time looking for food is really, really important for the health of our ecosystems. And just to show that I'm not making this up, here's a wonderful eastern barred bandicoot here foraging away. And when they finish, they leave these characteristic pits in the ground. And they feverishly work the soil over each night, leaving many, many of these pits per night. And I could tell you how many they leave, or I could actually leave the wonderful words of First Dog on the Moon, the famous Australian cartoonist, who very graciously actually covered our research with one of his cartoons, The Science of the Snoot Hole, as he calls it. And really the take-home message here is that these bandicoots are running around, or bounding around if you like, digging a huge number, 40 snoot holes an hour in some cases, and sometimes many hundred of snoot holes per night. And that can equate in some cases to 13 kilograms of dirt every evening per bandicoot, which is a huge amount when you consider how small bandicoots are. And if you scale that up, it can equal close to 5 tons per bandicoot per year, which is about the weight of an average African male elephant. So a huge amount of soil is being turned over. And what that does is it traps nutrients in these little holes that they dig. It means water can more easily get into the ground, seeds are captured, and it leads to increased fertility for our plants and healthier soils as well. We're also learning that moonlight affects our native mammals. So recent research led by Grant Linley has shown that mammals are affected by the moon, with, in this case, at Rothwell Sanctuary, about an hour west of Melbourne. Mammals were selecting or being more active, if you like, on nights that were darker, both quolls, predators of most of the mammals at Mount Rothwell, and their prey species or potential prey species. So again, bettongs, bandicoots, rock wallabies, and so forth were more active on darker nights. Elsewhere in the Mallee region, it's been shown that some species are also less active when it's lighter. So Bolham's mouse, a wonderful native mouse with huge ears, is less active. The Mallee ningawi as well. But pygmy possums, by contrast, are more active on moonlit nights. But what this really means in the larger context is that light itself is a really important influence on our wildlife. And it really is a lesson for us that our cities, as an example, which have huge amounts of artificial light pollution, may actually be having a disadvantageous effect for our wildlife. And so if we can do more to turn off lights, to minimize street lighting and so forth, we may actually be able to accommodate more of our native wildlife in our cities and urban areas. And that's really important, which again, I'll get to in a second with another story about animals that are living very close with us in urban areas. Now, I couldn't get away giving a mammal talk without briefly talking about dingoes, a species which I love and have worked on for many years now. And it's probably one of the most controversial species, I guess, and it really evokes a whole range of emotions, both positive and negative, in Australian society. And they're a deeply misunderstood species, and we're still learning lots about dingoes in terms of their role in landscapes. And using, I guess, modern technology like camera traps and, of course, genetic techniques as well, we're learning things about dingoes that we had sort of assumed in the past, but now we're actually finding out. And we're learning that they have a really important role in interacting with other species. So as an example, up here on the right-hand side, work from camera traps has shown that when dingoes are more active, baited in this case means where dingoes are being killed with 1080 poison, and below that unbaited is where dingoes are being left alone. When dingoes are being left alone, they are active both dawn and dusk, and cats avoid that time and are more active later in the night. And that can be really important for some species like small mammals, some of our reptiles and geckos and so forth, which tend to be quite active early in the night when it's warm, particularly in desert areas where things like insects are most active. But when dingoes are controlled and killed, cats can actually move their activity to be more active as a proportion of activity earlier in the night. And so that could actually have, again, a negative effect for our native wildlife. We're also learning what dingoes eat through a continental study led by Tim Doherty and others, many colleagues. One of the primary things that dingoes eat is another native animal, the kangaroo. Now, we all love kangaroos, But when kangaroos can become overabundant in some areas and overgraze vegetation, that can be a problem both for the ecosystems as well as the kangaroos themselves. And dingoes are one of the natural predators of kangaroos, and by far and away, that's their most preferred prey. They do, of course, eat some livestock, which leads to conflict, but it's actually a much smaller proportion of their diet than people would appreciate. They eat rabbits, insects, reptiles, so a really broad array of species. So they have a really important role as a top predator in the Australian ecosystem. And other work has been really striving to find ways to accommodate dingoes in the landscape, but while also actually protecting livestock producers from potential losses of livestock due to dingoes. And so work done by Lily Van Eden and others has shown that non-lethal methods, such as guardian dogs and fencing, are actually more effective in some cases than lethal methods like poisoning and shooting dingoes, and are sustained, importantly, for longer. So, you know, they're a more humane method of managing this problem, and they're sustained for longer. And so there really should be more investment and support for these methods. Importantly, also, many of us would remember, of course, we've had these devastating fires that have ravaged the Australian landscape over last summer and in fact, starting last winter. And one of the problems with those fires is that they can actually compound other threats. And that includes the impacts of things like feral cats and the red fox. So work, as an example, by Bron Radsky at Melbourne University has shown that before fire, this is the diet of foxes. So you can see that swamp wallabies is more than 50% of their diet. Critical weight range mammals, which are those mammals particularly sort of in the range of 35 grams to 5.5 kilos, the species that are typically historically most at risk of predation by feral cats and foxes are about 18%, rodents about 10%, and the rest is not pepperoni. But it's basically a whole range of different things, which includes things like blackberry, insects, and so forth. But what you can see that happens after fire, fire opens up the habitat, it reduces vegetation cover, and after fire, 3 times as many of these critical weight range mammals, so things like bandicoots and echidnas and possums, are being eaten by foxes. And we suspect that they are animals actually being caught and killed, not ones that have perished in the fires, because we found in the fox scats fresh hair, and the scats were collected weeks after the fire. So it's very likely that these foxes were basically taking advantage of this burnt landscape and killing many of these native animals. And this work was conducted in the Otways, southwest of Melbourne. But other work has shown in the Mallee region of northwest Victoria, led by former honours student and now PhD student at Deakin University, Billy Geary, has shown interestingly that dingoes themselves are selecting for more open burnt areas. And we suspect this may be that those more open burnt areas often have a flush of grass growth, which can attract kangaroos, and kangaroos are one of the preferred prey of dingoes. And what we found was that foxes were actually avoiding these areas, these more open areas, because they avoid dingoes. And so it's suggestive, at least, that dingoes may actually indirectly provide a benefit in these burnt landscapes by keeping foxes out of them. So there's a lot more to be understood about the role of the dingo in the context of fire and interactions with invasive species and how that may affect native wildlife. So as I've been sort of discussing tonight, you know, there's a whole range, I guess, of problems that we have with many of our native mammals in Australia, but of course more broadly across Australia. And the question is, well, what do we do about it? So I think one of the things that really comes home to me is the importance of working with communities. And this is a wonderful example that is not in Australia, but this is overseas. So this is a picture here is Jim Thomas here and working with colleagues in the Tankili Conservation Alliance. And they've been situated in Papua New Guinea for well over a decade, working with the local communities in a region called the Torricelli Mountains, which is north of the highlands in Papua New Guinea. And they began that work because they were really worried about the plight of tree kangaroo species. In particular, these 2 species pictured here. So this is the golden mantle tree kangaroo, and this is the Tankili tree kangaroo, otherwise known as Scotch tree kangaroo. And this image here, this video, is incredibly rare. So these species are orders of magnitude rarer than, say, the giant panda. probably only a few hundred left in the wild. And certainly before Jim and Jean Thomas began this work, working with local communities to find ways to conserve these wonderful animals across the forest, they absolutely faced extinction. And because of their efforts working with local communities, including providing clean water to communities, finding alternative sources of protein, including rabbits and fish, conserving forests and so forth, they've managed to actually protect these tree kangaroo species and many of the other wonderful animals that also co-occur with tree kangaroos. And so it really emphasizes that if we as conservation biologists want to conserve mammals, we have to be working with communities, including local Indigenous communities, both in Australia, but of course, in other parts of the world. So community is the important focus here. And I now want to talk about, I guess, the final story to do with mammals tonight. And that's about this wonderful animal here, the southern brown bandicoot. And many people, I think, have a sort of a false notion, if you like, that, you know, most of the wildlife is out in the wilderness areas, well beyond the city's limits. And our cities are essentially wastelands with very little wildlife. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Places like Melbourne actually have abundant wildlife, and many of our cities do. And there's been some fantastic research that's actually shown just how critical our cities are for conserving a whole range of threatened species. And these bandicoots are a really nice example of that. So the southern brown bandicoot occurs southeast of Melbourne and other parts of Victoria as well, but it's really suffered quite a dramatic reduction in its range overall. And like some of the other digging mammals, it's really important again because it spreads fungi and contributes to the health of our soils. And what's really fascinating about these bandicoots is that they're living in incredibly modified environments. So here we have example here, a southern brown bandicoot foraging on the side of a very busy arterial road. And this is a classic example of bandicoot habitat. As you can see, right in the middle of suburbia. You wouldn't think of that as being prime habitat for one of our marsupials. But interestingly, they're taking advantage of novel resources and novel habitat. So blackberry, gorse, you know, things that we often, you know, categorize as weeds and spend a lot of time getting rid of. These actually provide protection for the bandicoots from things like feral cats and foxes. And so it's really challenging because although we want to obviously do our best to control things like invasive plants, if there's no alternative vegetation available, native vegetation, then that can actually be disadvantageous for the bandicoots. So we need to think really carefully about how we manage these novel ecosystems and how that might actually affect our native wildlife. And what was interesting, just going back, what was interesting was that Sarah McLagan, who led this work, a PhD student, found that the bandicoots themselves were actually more abundant in these really peri-urban environments than in an adjacent conservation reserve, the Cranbourne Gardens. Now, that's not to say the Cranbourne Gardens isn't a wonderful place and performs a really important role. It absolutely does. But the areas that these bandicoots were occurring outside of this conservation reserve are along old drainage lines, which are part of the former Kooyarrup swamp, really productive, highly fertile soils. And the bandicoots were living in these areas, breeding in these areas, and doing particularly well. So again, it just kind of challenges our thinking about, you know, where native wildlife can occur and how we might manage them. The cheeky bandicoots were also really taking advantage of a whole range of resources that we might not think about. So in this case here, a bandicoot is helping itself to someone's cat food. And there was many instances of bandicoots actually appearing in people's backyards and helping themselves to pet food, which, although it might sound amusing, also really provides challenges again, because, you know, people want to have cats, they want to have dogs. And if bandicoots are using people's backyards, of course, that can potentially mean that bandicoots are at risk. And so finding ways to accommodate wildlife in these really urban areas alongside people's pets remains a challenge. And so there's ongoing work looking at how we might actually do this in these urban environments. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's inspiring to see that, you know, we can actually have these wonderful animals. So despite all the heavy losses that we've had of our native mammals in Australia, we do still have these wonderful species, including the southern brown bandicoot, holding on in some of our, you know, most busy and populous cities. And with that, I'd just like to thank a huge number of people. So I can't list them all here. There's just far too many, but really a lot of thanks goes to students, collaborators, colleagues, all the volunteers that spend countless hours both in the field and in the lab helping process data and so forth. The funding bodies, landowners, including Indigenous people who provide access to their country to work on, the many wildlife photographers that provided images for tonight's webinar, and of course the friends and the family that have supported myself and others conducting this work over the many years. And with that, I look forward to taking some questions. Thank you.